To bring us more details on this news story, I am joined in by a host of guests. Right now, I'm also joined in by Mr. G. Parthasarathi, former High Commissioner and former Information Advisor at Prime Minister's Office. Also joined in by our principal diplomatic correspondent, Siddhant Sibal, who's reporting live from New Delhi. Before we begin our discussion, let me quickly go across to Siddhant Sibal. Siddhant, what is that we can expect as far as the outcome goes, and when are the delegation level talks expected to begin?
Well, yes, a few minutes from now, before we can get those visuals, the handshake visual from the Hyderabad house, where the Indian Prime Minister is going to meet the Russian President Vladimir Putin second time in his two-day visit. He also yesterday met during that dinner at the residence of Prime Minister Narendra Modi. But here in New Delhi is of course decked up with Russian colors for that annual summit, the 19th India-Russia annual summit. 20 pacts are expected to be signed, including one of the most important is the S-400 deal, a deal that has been attracting attention given the fact that any country that has bought it has got the American sanctions. The Chinese got the American sanctions only last month, and the Turkey is also buying that S-400. This is an important equipment, especially for India's defense and security architecture, given the fact that India faces a two-front war from Pakistan and from China. But when we talk about India-Russia ties, well, we know that Russia is going to help in a lot of things. Of course, in nuclear energy, Russia is responsible for the Kudakulam nuclear power project. That's one of the largest nuclear power plants in India. But the Russians are also going to help India in its Gaganyaan mission, that is sending first manned mission, first Indian into the space by the year 2022. That is of course important. But if we look at the global power structure, if we look at the global order, today the relationship between Russia and New Delhi is very important, given the fact that we have seen how China has been growing in its assertive ways, and there is an unpredictable administration in Washington. There is a political subtext to the entire plot also, because we know that the S-400 deal is going to attract a lot of sanctions from the Americans, and we know that the Americans are not really happy about the entire deal happening between Russia and New Delhi.
Siddhant, precisely a very, very valid point mentioned over there by you. And on that note, I am precisely going to bring in Mr. Parthasarathi, who's joining us live from our Wion studios. Mr. Parthasarathi, a very warm welcome over here. You know, Siddhant, my colleague, just made a very valid point. He said that, you know, it's a very important time when Putin is in India at the moment. You have China's growing proximity with Russia. At the same time, despite the US sanctions against Russian defense firms, India has not been scared away from Russians by Washington's strong arming tactics. How do you view Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi's position at the moment?
Well, I think there is a broad continuity in Indian foreign policy, and we will not allow either the Americans or the Russians to dictate to us what our relations with the other party should be. In this particular case, America has passed this legislation on the sort of placing sanctions on those who get advanced weapon systems from the Russians. They have imposed those sanctions on China. But China is not exactly a friend, it is an adversary. There are three countries in Asia which are American partners, if not allies, which are India, Indonesia and Vietnam. All three of them have defense deals with Russia. The Indonesians being the latest for the Sukhoi 35 fighter. So they'll have to ponder over these sanctions, and in fact, even in discussions they have, within America there have been talk about showing understanding for the security requirements of people who are otherwise American partners. In the case of Vietnam and Indonesia, that will be forthcoming. On the S-400, my answer to the Americans is, brother, if you could give us an equivalent system, we'd buy it.
Right.
You don't have one. Their thought just is not a match. The other point is, we have two nuclear armed neighbors, one of whom is irresponsible and even threatens the use of nuclear weapons. And we need foolproof air cover for our capital and other strategic centers. the S-400 can provide it. So it's basically a defense system which we are taking at this point in time to make up for our shortcomings in the Air Force, which exist. So that is purely in security terms. But I think the Americans will hem and haw about this. It will be dragged on for some time. But we have fallback mechanisms.
Absolutely.
We've got payment arrangements other than US dollars.
You very rightly said we have fallback arrangements, and clearly it seems like India is in a position to bargain.
Yes.
And on that note, let me also bring in Dmitry Babich, who's a political analyst from the Russian international news agency Sputnik. He's joining us live from Moscow. Dmitry, a very, very warm welcome to you here on Wion. How do you analyze the entire situation, Dmitry? Because, India has defied the CAATSA, and how is Prime Minister Narendra Modi's position being viewed by the Russian media at the moment?
Well, in general, President Putin's visit to India is viewed very positively because we have an escalation of sanctions, not only from the United States, but also from the European Union. And Russians are not isolationist. We are not in an isolationist mood. We remember the fate of the Soviet Union, whose main mistake was that it tried to build a kind of an alternative economy, kind of isolated from the Western world and from its partners. Russia is not going to repeat that mistake. So the news that the president is coming to India and that deals are signed to the tune of billions on, Russia providing technical help to the Indian transportation companies, cooperation in the sphere of fertilizers, and of course, military sphere is very important. And Russia wants to help India to become an important player in the international affairs, including the military sphere.
Let me also go to Mr. Sarthi at the moment. Mr. Sarthi, what is it about Russia that makes this country such a long-term, reliable defense partner for India?
For the simple reason we've never had any difference of interests. You're talking about the Russian-Chinese relationship. I was in Moscow when the Russians attacked and destroyed Chinese army posts in the Ussuri River. So their border dispute runs deep, their historical differences run deep, and heart of hearts, no Russian trusts the Chinese. It's a marriage of convenience caused by misplaced American policies of hostility towards Russia.
True.
So I think towards India they find no such problem. Like towards Vietnam. India and Vietnam are to them in Asia two countries which have a lot in common, but certainly no adversity with them. So we are not likely to harm their interests. We don't function that way. For example, in Ukraine, it's a fact of life, and this is recorded. The Americans were massively interfering in the internal politics of Ukraine, including in the presidential elections. There is a recorded conversation between the Assistant Secretary of State and their ambassador, American ambassador in Kiev to this effect. So there is a point when the Russians are going to hit back. I don't buy Russian protestations of innocence that they were not involved. But I think the two of them will have to sort it out, that you don't keep messing around in each other's neighborhood or internal affairs.
Live visuals coming in of Prime Minister Narendra Modi meeting President Putin. So you were just informed that External Affairs Minister Sushma Swaraj had just arrived at the Hyderabad house, and now you can see that this is the 19th India-Russia summit, which is currently taking place as Prime Minister Narendra Modi and Russian President Vladimir Putin just displayed a firm handshake at the Hyderabad house in New Delhi. All right, going across to Mr. Parthasarthi, So, you know, it's interesting to note how India is expected to gift Russia 3 MiG aircrafts, you know, and this will be it will be a token of remembrance, you know, going back to the deal that was struck between India and Russia back in the 1960s. Also goes on to display, you know, the close strategic ties that India and Russia share. What do you make of this all-weather friendship at the moment, which has also stood the test of geopolitical changing times?
Let me tell you a personal experience on the MiG-21.
Please.
It is sentimental. 1965, I was in the army. I was in Pathankot. The MiG-21s had just arrived and were deployed in Pathankot, and we used them for air defense. This was 1965 conflict when we barely had a squadron. We dominated the 1971 conflict by air superiority. The air superiority was provided by the MiG-21s, which outclassed their American counterpart, which was the F-104. So MiG-21 is an aircraft, and several versions came in. Later on, when I was posted in Moscow, the original MiG-21 was replaced by a more powerful that was the MiG-21M, called the MiG-21 BIS, or the Bison. So the MiG-21 ran for about a decade and a half, 2 decades, as the primary aircraft, and then other things started coming in. But still, the MiG-21 Bison, acquired in the 70s, is still a part of the Air Force. So it's in some squadrons. So it is an aircraft which is highly sentimental for the Air Force, used very effectively by it, especially in 71. And therefore, it's, I think, a tribute to the Russians and an expression of thanks to the Russians for that particular aircraft and indeed their whole defense cooperation. Because till recently, the Russians dominated. Even today, your tanks, your armored personnel carriers, 200 of your primary fighters, your submarines,
right.
Everything is Russian. So, but the MiG-21 has a sentimental value going back to conflicts in 65 and 71.
Clearly, the MiG has sentimental value, and I'm glad that we have you along with us today to share those memories which are now symbolic. The MiG is symbolic of
yes.
India-Russia ties. On that note, let me also bring in Dmitry, who's also joining us live. This is a new chapter today that is beginning, you know, with India and Russia, even though we go back a long way, Dmitry. As I was just telling Mr. Parthasarathi that there are reports coming in that India will be presenting Russia with 3 vintage MiG supersonic fighter jets, which actually mark, a major agreement on military cooperation that was reached between India and Russia back in the 1960s. What do you have to say about this all-weather friendship that India and Russia have shared so far, which has also stood the test of time?
Well, indeed, if you look at the history of military-industrial cooperation between Russia and India, it goes to 1960, to the times when the Soviet Union was ruled by Nikita Khrushchev, who honestly believed in solidarity of leftist workers' movements around the world. For him, it was a serious matter. It was not a power token. He believed in it. And interestingly, he was right. I mean, 1960s was the time when independentist movements in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America became very strong. And the decision to engage with India, which was taken in 1960, to engage militarily, that was the right decision. But talking about more recent times, let me tell you that during this visit, India and Russia are planning some joint projects. For example, to produce the new tank T-90 together, to produce the new 5th generation fighter jet together. For us, this is a very important decision. And let me also comment a little bit on the similarities between President Putin and Prime Minister Modi.
Sure,
I think the main similarity is that in the beginning of their terms in power, they both tried to reach out to the West. If you remember, Putin tried to be a personal friend of George Bush the Jr., despite Mr. Bush's policies. He tried to engage with Tony Blair, with the European leaders. He helped the Americans in Afghanistan. The same is true about Narendra Modi, who tried to have a very good personal relationship with President Obama. I think the problem that both leaders, met in the West, it was not just President Trump's victory. I think the ideology of the modern West, which is in fact a very crude, a very primitive form of liberalism, neoliberalism, or ultra-liberalism, as I call it. The problem is that this ideology is very intolerant. And both Russia and India are having problems with the United States and sometimes with the European Union, primarily because of this new ideology. It's not dictated by the national interest of the United States or by the personal whims of President Trump alone. Basically, if you look at Russia, India, and even modern China, these are predictable, pragmatic countries which are suggesting pragmatic solutions. The problem is that some of these solutions are simply not ideologically acceptable for the West, which views Russia, China, and to a lesser extent India with a kind of mistrust. So this is the main problem, and strangely this problem separates us from the West, but it brings us closer to the countries like India, to the countries like China, to the countries like Arab states or even Pakistan. So it is a very interesting new development, which I think we should encourage between President Putin and Narendra Modi. It's already a new beginning, not only in the technical sense, in the economic sense, but also in the ideological sense. I think we have these powerful states, emerging markets, as they're called, Russia and India, basically resisting and suggesting an alternative to the globalist project, whose defects we see very clearly now.
Right. Dmitry, you are right in saying that this is a new beginning for India and Russia, even though we go back a very long time. Interestingly enough, you mentioned about the mistrust coming towards Russia from the West. There have been accusations targeting, that Russia is targeting the OPCW, which is investigating the use of chemical weapons in Syria and the poisoning of former spy Skripal and his daughter, along with a host of cyber attack accusations against Russia. How do you view the recent developments where countries like the US, UK, Canada and the Netherlands are sort of ganging up on Russia?
Well, if you look at these accusations, some of them are clearly exaggerated, to put it mildly. I mean, if you look at the latest news from the UK, they accuse the Russian intelligence service, GRU, of even targeting Russian institutions, including the Russian central bank. Look at the statement from Jeremy Hunt, the British foreign minister. And for this is obviously absurd. Okay, every intelligence wants to know the secrets of other countries, including political secrets. So I can imagine that Russians could want to find out details about Hillary Clinton's campaign, just like the Americans basically published through their media a lot of information about President Putin's campaign and President Yeltsin's campaign. They helped Yeltsin win in 1996 openly. I remember their advisors, their so-called political technologists, coming here to Moscow and basically crushing the communist opposition here, using some of the most modern media techniques. So I think we have a kind of selective justice here. When the United States or the European countries, when they interfere in developing countries, supporting certain political groups, so-called liberals usually, they view it as a regular practice, support for democracy. When other countries, including Russia and China, when they want to protect their interests, These countries have been accused of breaching international law. Give me a break. You know, Mr. Trump did not win in the United States because some Russians posted something on Facebook. He won because people in the United States were unhappy with the globalist policies. You know, the globalist policies were affecting the well-being of the American middle class. I'm not even speaking about the American working class, which was crushed by the displacement of American companies from, you know, basically carrying production from the United States to countries like...
On that very point, I am going to bring in Mr. Parthasarathi. Dimitri is making a point over here that there's been selective justice when you come to the global scenario. Do you agree with that point?
Well, I think we have a basic point of agreement and also a point of difference with the Russians. In the sense, Russia veers between enmity. When I was in Moscow, number one enemy was not the United States, it was China. They fought a brief border war on the Ussuri River with China. And now they are starry-eyed about China because the process they are providing Chinese with weapons which that do not exactly make us feel comfortable. But that is their business, how they deal with globally. We are not a part of their globalized system or a part of the American globalized system. We maintain our independence, meaning we want good relations with all. In the case of China, that is more difficult than it is with either the Americans or the Russians, because the Chinese are out to end any form of Indian influence across the Indian Ocean. So there is a difference, there is similarity, but I think we have learned to live with those differences. We are not going to look at China in the same starry-eyed manner which the Russians are given to doing today. And I know for a fact, I visit Moscow, that is only the dikhavat, as we would call it in Hindi. You talk to a Russian and scratch him under the skin, he will not say any words nice or trustworthy about China. So that is their business and we should not comment on it. We have our independent policy. We will not allow the Americans to dictate to us whether or not we should buy S-400 missiles from Russia.
But coexistence is something that we...
Yeah, but I mean, if the Russians are really willing to offer us a fifth generation fighter, I would look at it. Thus far, the experience has not been enthralling. But the Russian relationship is very important to us. We do not want to be dependent on any single power anywhere in the world. And it gives us a greater leverage and flexibility in conducting our relations. And why should we have bad relations with any major power?
Absolutely. We will be talking about more on this, and we will also touch upon how oil has an important role to play. But before that, India and Russia have historically enjoyed strong ties, and there is no doubt about that. The relationship between the two nations was slow to take off after independence, but since then it has been based on mutual trust and cooperation. Ties between India and Russia started off while India was working to lift its people out of poverty. India was heavily dependent on Russia for weapons, technology and industrial investment. New Delhi required Moscow's diplomatic and military support during the 1965 and 1971 wars with Pakistan. During the 1971 war, as the Indian Army launched an assault on the then eastern Pakistan, United States dispatched a naval fleet with a nuclear-powered aircraft carrier into the Bay of Bengal. India secretly activated a provision in the Indo-Soviet Friendship Treaty and called for Moscow's help. A Russian naval task force from the Pacific Fleet based in Vladivostok, consisting of a cruiser, a destroyer and 2 attack submarines, were dispatched to the Bay of Bengal. As an indication of how serious the Russians were about defending India, Moscow started dispatching naval detachments from across the globe to Indian waters. India and Russia's partnership has historically been in the field of defense, and that cooperation has only strengthened over the years. Today, the relationship pretty much centers solely on arms sales by Russia to India. Dimitri, it's very interesting to note that India might just get a waiver on the S-400 purchase, which is something that China couldn't manage from the US.
Well, there is absolutely no doubt that relations between India and the United States are better than relations between China and the United States. Well, I must tell you that actually Mr. Obama, the former president, I think he was a foreign policy disaster for his country because he managed the impossible. He managed Russia and to make Russia and China a kind of allies. At least these countries, for the first time in many decades, are looking more and more like allies, which is, from a pragmatic point of view, a completely almost unreal development, because real differences of national interest between Russia and China are huge, and the differences, the conflict with the United States is primarily ideological. So it just shows you how much the United States is unable to actually be led in its policy by real national interest and not by ideological considerations. The Russian elite is not anti-American. It's not anti-Western. The Russian elite, since at least since the coming to power of Mikhail Gorbachev in the late 80s, the Russian elite has been trying to integrate itself into the Western elite. The problem is that the Western elite interpreted the end of hostility between Russia and the West in the early 90s as its victory. We viewed it as a kind of, Merry Christmas, war is over. They viewed it as their victory. And this was the major difference in understanding of what happened. This difference, unfortunately, continues until now. And Mr. Obama himself alienated China when, in 2014, when he had a crisis in relations with Russia because of the Ukrainian situation, because of the coup d'etat in Ukraine. Mr. Obama came to Vietnam, he came to the Philippines, and he promised all of them full support in their confrontation with China. So in the same month, Putin finally managed to sign a deal with the Chinese authorities on the sales of Russian natural gas. Until then, the Chinese were suggesting an unreasonably low price for the Russian natural gas. Then, after some pressure from Mr. Obama, they started suggesting real price. So all of that doesn't mean that Russia doesn't want good relations with India or that Russia has suspicions about India. Look at the defense projects. Defense projects which Russia is suggesting. We want to make missiles together with India. For example, the famous BrahMos project. It's a joint project. Why are we doing it? Because we trust India. We trust that whatever the relations between China and India in future, whatever the relations between India and Pakistan, India will never be our enemy. So we don't want to hide from Indians what we can do, how we do it, including in the military sphere.
Absolutely, Dmitry. I completely agree with you because, our ties finally go back a very long way. And, I was just telling Mr. Parthasarathi that India is gifting 3 vintage MiG-21 aircraft, supersonic fighter jets to Russia as a reminder of a major agreement on military cooperation that was reached between the two countries back in the 1960s. So that's how old our ties have been. Also, it's not just about defense partnership. Our relationship also goes beyond that. It also goes to oil. And I'm going to discuss about that because Indian companies have invested billions in strategic Russian projects, including the Russian oil company, the Vankoneft and Tas-Yuyaka. So it's important to talk about how oil is also playing an important role when it comes to ties between India and Russia.
Who's that for?
All right. I think we are countering some technical issues here in terms of our chat with Dmitry. But Mr. Parthasarathi, please go ahead and speak about the importance of oil in our relationships, not just with Russia, but also here with America.
Well, in the case of Russia, in the case of oil, it was really gas, natural gas. We signed our first large investment agreement on a gas field abroad. That was with Russia. That has been a very successful agreement. There's some amounts of up to $5 billion in it. And that has progressively increased. In the meantime, the Russians have struck a huge deal of investing about $6 billion on SR in India. So there is a Russian presence on the energy sector, oil and natural gas with SR, and with us in Russia.
And a lot of joint partnership mechanisms.
So yes, that's what leads to the joint partnerships. Now, what is a more recent development is that we have started importing Russian oil and natural gas. I think Mr. Pradhan had announced that recently. So it's going to be interesting because the Russians have a good thing with Iran. There is no problem in our buying Russian oil and natural gas, though technically speaking the Americans have objections to it. But even Germany have ignored those protests. So yes, energy is going to be a major field. Oil, natural gas, nuclear energy. The Kudankulam power plant, very successful. Others coming up. Russian nuclear energy, very reliable, very safe. And therefore, the cooperation is going to grow. And once you have the defense and energy going together, it really means security. It's defense security and energy security. But you asked about the Americans. We are also buying oil and natural gas from American companies. After shale gas was discovered in the United States, their prices are competitive. And for us, these purchases help us to get the Arab Gulf countries to keep their prices manageable, and also for a message to Iran that we have several options. So you have to diversify your options, not keep it exclusive. We were too dependent on the Gulf.
And especially very dependent on Iran.
Yes. Iran, and now
the sanctions will hit India the most.
Look, it is going to, what we will have to negotiate with the Americans, because this is not because we want it, because of the realities. If Iran was prepared for bilateral rupee payments, yes, we could buy any amount. Iran has bilateral agreements with Russia and China. It doesn't have one with us. I think there is a measure of Iranian hubris in that, but that's for them to decide. Otherwise, we will be prepared to buy. In the absence of that, we run into real problems on banking, because every Indian bank is sort of linked with the American dollar. Every Indian bank that counts. So there are payments problems, and therefore it goes down. But Chabahar, I think, is a major project for us because it gives us connectivity to Afghanistan, and it suits the Americans also.
And you mentioned Afghanistan, which I am also going to be discussing when it comes to India-Russia ties. But before that, what exactly is the S-400 missile system, which is the crux of the matter today, especially when it comes to India and Russia's bilateral talks? S-400 air defense missile system has got a target range of 400 kilometers. It can hit 300 simultaneous targets. Also, 72 guided missiles can simultaneously be launched from the system. The system has been operational since 2007, and China was its first buyer. S-400 missile system can prepare any military for defense against strategic aircraft, electronic warfare planes, spy planes, and tactical aircraft. So, Mr. Parthasarathi, this is indeed, I think, a big win for India if India manages to finally ink this deal, which it is all set to with Mr. Putin now.
I would be disappointed if we didn't, because it's the best missile. Our armed forces deserve the best. And our American friends should know, if any country in the world with any common sense has to choose between the S-400 and what they have on offer.
Do you finally see a third for the third?
Yes, there is a third for the third at the present, American third. At the present moment, it can't match the S-400. And as I said, we have to defend our society, our cities and industrial centers against air attacks, which we cannot allow to succeed. And we have two potential threats on that score. One is irresponsible, the other is is responsible. And the threat from the West, you have unpredictable people. So I think missile defenses are crucial.
You mentioned that, we have to coexist, and that, the threat from the West also has to be put on the backseat, or has to be rather controlled in a way. So do you see, will America continue to look at India as a partner they don't want to lose? Because let's not forget that Lockheed Martin has a long-standing defense deal with the Tata Group, where they build wings for the C-130 Hercules. So can America actually afford to lose out on a growing market like India?
No, the basic problem is with regard to Lockheed, our Air Force has evaluated it. It's the F-16.
All right.
And, it's not really matched up with matched up with the others, especially the Rafale. So it's a choice. But we have no problems with the Americans choose to invest on aeronautics in India. It would be welcomed, because ultimately in aeronautics, the Americans lead the rest of the world by miles, and we would be more than happy to have that.
All right. I think, Mr. Parthasarathi, I'm also, Dimitri is back with us. There was some technical error, but he's back. Dimitri, my question to you is, how important is it for Moscow equally to develop ties with New Delhi? Because India is also a co-member of the BRICS, and Indian companies have also invested billions in strategic Russian projects, including Russia's oil company. So oil, and as Sir mentioned, that natural gas also has an important role to play when it comes to India and Russia.
True. Talking about the energy cooperation, there is a plan of building the so-called North-South corridor. For centuries, the Russian infrastructure was geared to Western Europe. We were exporting to Western Europe all kinds of goods. In the 20th century, in the second half of the century,
all right.
Our customers. So we want to develop the east-west, but also south, which of course goes to India. Right now, our trade with India satisfies us. We to the June 6 million a year.
All right. So we'll try to reconnect with Dimitri. But in the meanwhile, Mr. Parthasarathi, do you think that US is unlikely to seek revenge on India via a trade war? Because Donald Trump had just called India the tariff king just a few days ago. And especially when it comes to regarding the import of Harley-Davidsons in India. But do you think that a trade war is actually in the offing, or you just think that
I think, look, there are problems. Some of which they have taken us to the WTO, but then it's not only the United States, a number of other countries have also taken us to the WTO, including the Russians. So the thing is, we expect to resolve that with the United States. We've been talking to them. Yes, there are many countries in the world believe that some of our tariffs are very unreasonable in the present day world. But in the present day world, the United States is doing a U-turn on tariffs. So I think this is an issue we'll sort out. And don't forget that on many of these things, you've seen Vice President Pence's statement yesterday about the importance they attach to relations with India. The fact of the matter is, Defense Secretary Mattis is very clear about that if they have to manage Chinese power in what they call the Indo-Pacific, but for us is primarily the Indian Ocean, they need India's support. So as far as I'm concerned, an effective balance of power in the Indian Ocean prevented any Chinese domination of this area. Yes, they don't want it, we don't want it. So cooperation with the United States is very important.
I'm quickly wrapping up, sir. I'm so sorry that I'm running short of time. But on the last note, my last question to you is, when it comes to India and Russia, and the whole position on Afghanistan, that's where I see a bit of differences simmering. How do you analyze it in a quick gist?
In a quick thing, the Russians seem to feel the ISIS is the major threat. They seem to be cozy with the Taliban. That's something we are not very comfortable with, but it's something we can live with because it's up to them. But we would prefer that some of the arms relationships which there are suspicions about they're having with the Taliban come to an end. And more important, politically, it is for the Taliban to settle their problems with the Afghan government.
Right.
I don't think Russia, America or India should be interfering on that. And most importantly, Pakistan should not interfere in that.
One factor that should unite Russia and India. On that note, thank you so much, Mr. Parthasarathy, for joining us here. Also, a big thanks to Dmitry for joining us via Skype. You guys made the discussion finally a success.